The village rested in a hollow of silence, its streets narrow and its houses leaning as though time itself pressed them downward. At its edge stood a manor of stone and timber, solid and dependable, known for one detail above all else. In its uppermost window, every night without fail, a lantern glowed. The villagers whispered it was a sign of mercy, a symbol that no woman in need would ever be turned away. To those who lived with the weight of pregnancy, the lantern meant hope. For the women who owned the manor called themselves midwives. They were Anna and Isolde, sisters in blood or spirit, none could agree, whose calm voices and measured steps gave the impression of order and safety. Their names carried no stain, their presence drew trust, and the poor and the noble alike brought their daughters to them when the burden of childbirth grew too heavy to bear. But a lantern can conceal as much as it reveals. Its glow promised warmth, yet it also cast long shadows. Behind the thick walls of the manor, the truth unfolded not as mercy but as a ritual rehearsed over years, carried out with the patience of a scientist and the devotion of a zealot. The women understood the village too well. They knew people were too afraid to question disappearances, too eager to believe that someone had moved away, too ready to accept that suffering was the natural fate of women. They used this silence as their cloak. They whispered prayers over their victims, not to God, but to something that thrived in secrecy. In their eyes, pain was not punishment, but revelation. They convinced themselves that the scream of a mother was the true cry of creation, more sacred than birth itself. Each woman who entered the lantern-lit manor crossed an invisible threshold. She came with swollen belly and trembling heart, believing she would be met with kindness. Instead, she was studied like a specimen. Anna's eyes followed every twitch, every gasp, as if cataloging the limits of endurance. Isolde's hands prepared the chamber, wiping clean the wooden bed that carried deep scars beneath its linens. Together they spoke of easing pain, yet what they meant was reshaping it into something useful, something that could be harvested. For them, suffering was not a tragedy but a material, and they believed they had been chosen to craft it into meaning. They called it medicine, they called it mercy, but in truth it was a hunger neither could silence. The first women who came never returned. Their names faded from the parish records as though they had never existed. The sisters explained that some had lost their infants and wished to start anew in another village. Others, they said, had chosen the convent, retreating from the world in grief. The explanations were given calmly, with no tremor of guilt, and those who asked too many questions were answered with pitying smiles. Yet beneath the floorboards lay the fragments of the truth, bones buried shallow, ribs broken not by childbirth but by deliberate crushing, skulls cleaved with precision as though mapped in advance. Each body was arranged with method, limbs bent into shapes of old fertility symbols, as though the sisters sought to capture not just life but its essence, twisting ritual into an art of silence. The lantern itself became a weapon of trust. On winter nights when winds howled across the fields, the glowing window called to those in need like a star guiding lost travelers. A mother clutching her belly, blood already staining her skirts, would see the light and believe she was safe. In that moment of surrender, she belonged to Anna and Isolde. Her life, her body, and the unborn within her became instruments in their design. The sisters were not driven by frenzy but by cold patience. Each cut, each breath withheld was recorded in memory as if part of a ledger. They marveled at the way the body resisted, the way despair could deepen the voice into a guttural cry, the way silence came only when the spirit finally broke. To them, death was not the end, but a necessary step in revealing the hidden language of suffering. The village, blind and grateful, fed this hunger. Each disappearance deepened the sisters' conviction that their work was destined, protected by the ignorance of those who prayed for their aid. The lantern burning endlessly was no beacon of hope, but a lure into darkness. And so the manor became both sanctuary and snare, a place where innocence entered and silence emerged. The world outside carried on, unaware that within those walls mercy was stripped of meaning, reshaped into ritual and lit by a flame that no one dared to question. What began as trust had become an altar, and the lantern in the window was its eternal invitation. Anna and Isolde understood that cruelty could not survive in the open. To endure, it had to wear a mask so convincing that no one would dare question it. Their chosen disguise was mercy, and they stitched it carefully into their every movement, every word, every glance that passed between them. They studied the mannerisms of respected women, bowing their heads in humility, speaking softly about faith and duty, and weaving the names of saints into their promises. In the village square, they stood with baskets of bread and herbs, offering aid to the poor, blessing children as though they were protectors of life. But in the solitude of their manor, mercy was stripped of its meaning, redefined into a currency of suffering. They learned early that innocence was the perfect veil. Those who appeared pious and charitable would never be accused, not when they stood so close to the image of holiness. Their fascination stretched far beyond the small village, reaching toward the whispers of Catherine de' Medici, whose name was still spoken in hushed tones. The Queen's rumored interest in alchemy and hidden sciences of the womb became a legend, and Anna and Isolde treated that legend as scripture. They claimed that Catherine had once believed the womb was not simply a vessel for life, but a door to hidden truths. With this inspiration, they convinced themselves they were chosen to continue her work in secret, that their experiments were not crimes but revelations. It gave their acts a strange nobility, an excuse to carry cruelty under the name of progress. They studied herbs to slow labor, tools to open the body in unnatural ways, and poisons that preserved rather than destroyed. Every cruelty was explained as necessary, every scream dismissed as the cost of knowledge. The disguise of mercy deepened as their reputation grew. Women of wealth began to hear of their skills, believing they offered safety when childbirth so often meant death. Nobles sent their servants in secrecy, afraid of scandal, and the sisters welcomed them with gentle voices and candlelit rooms. But once the doors were closed, the rituals began. A woman in labor was strapped into a bed with leather bindings disguised as supports. She was told it was for her safety so she would not thrash and harm the child. In truth, it was to still her body so that Anna and Isolde could observe every tremor, every tightening muscle, every breaking breath. They whispered prayers, soothing their victim even as they drew knives across her belly, not to deliver life, but to test how much flesh could be cut without ending it. Mercy became the word they repeated while extinguishing every trace of hope. Each death was methodical, not sudden, for the sisters believed in slow unraveling. They experimented with ways to prolong breath, pressing damp cloths steeped in wine over the face until the woman suffocated into unconsciousness, then pulling it away so she would awaken again in pain. They salted wounds under the guise of cleansing, ensuring that agony burned deeper with every contraction. Some mothers were allowed to deliver, but their children were never handed to them. The infants were taken into the next chamber where silence and vinegar-soaked cloths ended their cries within moments. The women would beg to see their newborns, their voices hoarse, their hearts clinging to hope. But Anna and Isolde would only lean close and assure them their babies had been taken to heaven. That final lie was always spoken with calm certainty, as if deceit was the purest act of kindness. The villagers, meanwhile, saw only the surface of this disguise. They heard the sisters speak of long hours at the bedside, of weeping alongside mothers who lost their infants, of burying the dead with gentle prayer. They accepted each disappearance with averted eyes, unwilling to probe the shadows behind the lantern's glow. Even when questions arose, the sisters silenced them with ritual explanations. They claimed that women who vanished had chosen to retreat into religious solitude, a practice admired though rarely questioned. Others, they said, had left to escape the shame of failed births, seeking new beginnings in distant towns. Their words carried weight because they were spoken with conviction, never faltering, never betraying the truth that lay beneath their calm exterior. Yet within themselves, Anna and Isolde were not blind to what they had become. They knew they had crafted a role so convincing that even they sometimes believed it. They had woven a disguise so tightly around their cruelty that it became indistinguishable from their own faces. But it was not holiness that guided them, only hunger. Each act of suffering fed something within them, a need that mercy alone could never satisfy. They had learned to mask their obsession beneath the rituals of care, hiding violence in plain sight. And as the lantern continued to glow in the window, their deception spread further, drawing new mothers into their grasp. The disguise of mercy was complete, and beneath its veil the slow harvest of pain continued night after night, unseen by all who trusted the light. The journals they kept were bound in leather, their pages thick with ink and annotations carefully numbered as if each act of cruelty was an entry in a sacred text. To an untrained eye, they resembled the notebooks of any physician of the time, filled with diagrams of the womb, herbal recipes, and notes on the movements of the moon. But closer reading revealed something more unsettling, a philosophy woven through each line. Pain, they wrote, was not an accident of childbirth. It was a mirror of divine truth. To endure agony was to touch the very hand of God, and the screams of women were not cries for help, but revelations of hidden design. Inspired by the writings of Paracelsus, who sought to understand the secrets of nature through suffering and transformation. Anna and Isolde convinced themselves that pain was not cruelty but the highest form of knowledge. Their doctrine became both shield and weapon, allowing them to commit horrors with the calm conviction of scholars. Within those journals, they cataloged methods that were precise and symbolic, as though each act of torment carried meaning beyond the body it destroyed. They devised a practice where the pregnant woman was forced to labor while lying in a cradle tilted at an impossible angle, so that her child descent became a struggle against gravity itself. They recorded how long the body resisted, how muscles tore under pressure, and they described it as measuring endurance against the weight of heaven. In another entry, they detailed the ritual of salt baptism, where raw salt was pressed into torn flesh under the guise of cleansing, a torment so unbearable that consciousness slipped away and returned again like a tide. They insisted this pain unlocked a purity of spirit, the moment when the veil between body and soul thinned, and they wrote with satisfaction that in this state, a woman's prayers carried greater weight than in any church. Each death was not only observed but carefully compared, as though they were building a taxonomy of agony. They noted the difference between suffocation and blood loss, between starvation and forced labor, charting the patterns of screams as if they were melodies in a hymn. Some victims were given opiates, not to ease suffering but to prolong it, dulling the edge of pain just enough so that the body could survive repeated tortures across days rather than hours. Others were starved slowly, their infants fed separately while mothers listened to muffled cries in the next chamber, their spirits unraveling under the weight of helplessness. The sisters recorded each psychological collapse as carefully as they did the physical, convinced that despair itself was a sacrament. To them, suffering was not an accident to be prevented, but a design to be curated, cultivated, and finally harvested. They shaped childbirth into ritual. The moment of crowning became an altar where they tested how long a woman could be forced to withhold pushing, clamping her thighs with iron restraints until both mother and child teetered between life and death. They wrote with fascination about the swelling, the suffocation, the quiet twitching of a newborn denied breath, and they claimed this liminal space revealed God's decision more clearly than prayer. Some infants were pressed into vats of hot wine, their bodies scalded in silence, while mothers were told they had been taken away to baptism. Others were embalmed in wax immediately after birth, preserved as objects of study, their tiny forms treated as relics of sacrifice. Each act was justified in the journals as necessary, a way to glimpse the hidden order of creation through destruction. And each act left behind not only broken bodies but broken spirits, women whose final hours were spent in terror and betrayal. The toll on the sisters themselves was not visible in their behavior but evident in their writings. The more they inflicted, the calmer they became. They no longer described their victims as women or children, but as vessels, instruments, and specimens. Their language grew colder with each page, replacing human terms with symbols of ritual and experiment. Yet beneath the calm surface there was hunger, a need that could never be sated, only deepened. Every scream heard and every silence achieved became proof that they were chosen, guardians of knowledge no one else dared claim. The doctrine of pain had consumed their humanity, leaving only the mask of mercy and the machinery of cruelty. The lantern in the window still burned each night, its glow seen as a promise of safety. But within those walls, the journals grew thicker with every passing season, each entry another step into a world where suffering was scripture and death itself became their teacher. The manor was built like many others of its time, with timbered beams and plaster walls, but deep within its foundation was a space no visitor ever entered. Behind a panel of wood, concealed by shelves of herbs and jars, lay a narrow stair that wound into darkness. At the bottom stood a chamber carved from stone, its air damp, its walls blackened with smoke from the lamps that burned without ceasing. This was the sisters' hidden sanctuary, the heart of their doctrine, where tools of their own making waited in silence. It was here that their mercies turned to methods and their fascination with pain was transformed into machinery. To walk into that room was to step into a place where suffering had been engineered with precision, where every instrument bore the mark of minds that saw torment as both science and scripture. At the center stood a series of cradles unlike any meant for children. These were fashioned of iron and wood, their interiors lined with thin sheets of metal that could be heated until they glowed faintly red. Mothers were placed within them, their skin pressed to warmth that quickly grew unbearable. The sisters justified the design by calling it a trial of purity, claiming that as ore was refined by fire, so too could flesh reveal the truth of the soul. Women screamed until their voices cracked, their skin blistering against the heated surfaces, and still Anna and Isolde recorded the length of each cry. The moment breath broke into silence, and the time it took for life to falter. The cradles were not instruments of birth, but coffins of fire, each one meant to turn the body into testimony. In the corner of the chamber, upon a table marked with iron stains, lay a device they called the womb pump. It was a grotesque imitation of medical syringes described in rare alchemical texts, but fashioned with tubes and levers that drew not medicine but blood. Inserted into the body of a woman, it pulled steadily, drop by drop, as if milking life itself. The blood was collected in glass vessels and placed before candles as offerings, the flickering light turning red liquid into a false sacrament. Some victims were drained slowly over hours, left conscious long enough to feel their strength dissolve into weakness, until their arms trembled and their eyes dimmed. Others were emptied quickly, their bodies collapsing in spasms, their unborn children suffocated within. The sisters wrote of these sessions with clinical calm, as though they were studying rainfall, not extinguishing lives. Against one wall hung swaddles of rough linen stiffened with salt. To an outsider, they looked like cloths meant to wrap a child in warmth, but when dampened and pressed tight, they became wrappings of death. Infants were bound within them, the salt-burning delicate skin, drawing moisture until the tiny bodies stiffened into silence. Some were left alive for hours, their movements weakening until they became still as carved figures. The sisters believed these mummified remains carried the essence of sacrifice, and they preserved them in wooden boxes as relics. They convinced themselves that each preserved infant was proof of their divine work, symbols of endurance offered back to the heavens. The cruelty was not done in rage or madness, but in ritual calm, their hands steady as they wrapped, their voices murmuring prayers as though they were baptizing rather than killing. The chamber held smaller tools as well, each designed with intention. Hooks shaped to lift flesh away from bone, clamps to hold the cervix open far beyond its natural limit, and needles heated before being driven under nails to test how far pain could travel through the body. There were bowls of herbs mixed with vinegar to prolong contractions, making labor a torment that stretched into endless hours. Chains hung from the ceiling not for restraint but for display, forcing women to labor upright while their weight tore them from within. The instruments gleamed with use, wiped clean not to hide the crime but to ready them for the next body. Every surface of the chamber spoke of repeated ritual, each stain and scar a record of suffering that no one outside would ever see. What made this chamber most horrifying was not the presence of the tools but the silence of their makers. Anna and Isolde did not rage or laugh as they worked. Their voices remained calm, their expressions thoughtful, as though they were discussing household tasks rather than orchestrating torment. They believed themselves beyond cruelty, beyond even morality, guided by a higher purpose that no one else could grasp. In their eyes, the instruments were not weapons, but instruments of discovery, ways to peel back the skin of existence and glimpse the hidden design beneath. Yet every mother who entered was reduced to an object, her body stripped of dignity, her cries reduced to data. Death came not as an accident, but as the inevitable conclusion of a ritual carefully rehearsed. Above the chamber, the lantern in the window still burned, its light spilling gently over the village streets. No one knew that its flame was fed by the silence of that room below, where life was harvested in the name of mercy. And with every passing night, as the instruments cooled and the bodies were hidden away, the sisters grew more certain that their work was destined to continue, protected by secrecy, cloaked in innocence, and driven by the hunger of minds that no longer saw themselves as human. The village ledger, kept in the parish house with careful script, began to show a pattern long before anyone dared speak of it. Names of women, many young, some noble, some poor, were marked as having left the parish. The reason was always the same, written in the same hand: moved away. To an outsider, the records told a story of migration, of restless mothers seeking new beginnings elsewhere. But within the village, those who whispered in private knew that many of these women had last been seen walking beneath the glow of the lantern in the midwives' window. They entered heavy with child, clutching their bellies with fear and hope alike, and were never seen again. Their absence was explained with a softness that silenced doubt. Anna and Isolde, faces calm and hands folded in prayer, told families that their daughters had chosen to start anew, far from shame or loss. The explanations were given with such certainty that grief turned into resignation, and no one demanded proof. Yet silence has its limits, and with each disappearance, a faint unease spread through the parish. Mothers crossed themselves when they passed the manor at night, while fathers muttered questions in the tavern that quickly fell quiet when the sisters' names were mentioned. The lantern's glow was still seen as a symbol of mercy, but beneath it was the growing suspicion that mercy carried a cost no one wanted to calculate. Fear bound the villagers into complicity, each family convincing itself that the loss of one woman was an isolated tragedy, not part of a greater pattern. And in that silence, the midwives thrived, their ledger of torment growing as steadily as the parish records of departures. It was not until a bishop visited, summoned on unrelated matters, that the first fracture in their disguise appeared. He came to review church finances and inspect relics, but he also heard the rumors of women vanishing. Unlike the villagers, he was not bound by kinship or fear, and his curiosity was sharpened by authority. He walked the village paths, listening to hesitant testimonies, noting the trembling voices that spoke of sisters who offered mercy too freely, who buried the dead too quietly. His steps finally carried him to the manor where the lantern still burned. Anna and Isolde greeted him with bowed heads and soft words, their house smelling of herbs and incense. But his eyes wandered to the floorboards where the air carried a faint rot no prayers could mask. At night, when the sisters retreated, the bishop returned in secrecy, armed with nothing more than a lantern and a sense of holy duty. He pried open a corner of the floor, and what he uncovered would never reach the ears of the congregation in full. Beneath the boards lay bones packed into shallow soil, not scattered in decay, but arranged with intention. Femurs crossed like the arms of a crucifix, skulls tilted upward as though in prayer, ribs splayed outward to form shapes reminiscent of ancient fertility idols. The bodies were not simply hidden but transformed into symbols, grotesque echoes of rituals long buried by the church. It was as though Anna and Isolde had fused pagan sacrifice with Christian devotion, twisting both faiths into one design. The bishop stared into that pit of silence and understood that what was buried there was not only flesh, but belief itself, mutilated into a doctrine of pain. The bones told stories the records never did. Pelvic bones cracked wide revealed births forced beyond endurance, tiny skulls, some still bound with salt-stiffened cloth, spoke of infants taken before their first breath. Finger bones bent at unnatural angles showed restraints tightened to breaking. Each arrangement was not a haphazard burial but a tableau, a silent liturgy written in the language of bone. The bishop knew he could not reveal this to the parish without unraveling faith itself, without admitting that within the shadow of the lantern, the church's silence had allowed evil to flourish. He prayed in that chamber, but no prayer silenced the memory of those hollow sockets staring upward, forever fixed in expressions of betrayal. Anna and Isolde continued as before, untouched by suspicion. The bishop returned to his diocese carrying the weight of what he had seen, choosing not to expose them publicly but to let the ledger of God record what mortal ink could not. He told himself the parish was too fragile, that truth would shatter the faith of innocent souls, but his silence gave the sisters freedom to continue. Each new disappearance was swallowed by ritual explanation, each family consoled by words that masked slaughter. The village carried on, its children baptized, its marriages blessed, all beneath the glow of a lantern that no one dared extinguish. The midwives had turned mercy into disguise, torture into ritual, and death into a pattern so ordinary it became invisible. And as the bones beneath their floorboards multiplied, their chamber of instruments grew busier, their journals thicker, their confidence sharper. The disappearances no longer caused fear but became a rhythm, a pulse in the life of the village, one that no one dared confront. Above ground, the records would forever say that mothers had moved away. Below ground, their bones would remain locked into patterns only Anna and Isolde understood. And in the silence of those two worlds, the official record and the hidden truth, the sisters found their greatest shield. What began as whispers had grown into proof, yet proof itself had been buried. And so the lantern in the window continued to shine, its light a promise to those outside, its glow a curse to those within, and its shadow stretching further into the years to come. Whispers spread not only through the village but beyond, carried in the hushed gossip of servants and the secret letters of courtiers. Rumors of women who could ease the pains of childbirth or end them entirely found their way into noble halls, In an age when queens feared dying on the birthing bed as much as they feared enemies at court, any promise of control over the womb carried power. Anna and Isolde were no longer seen as humble midwives, but as keepers of knowledge too dangerous to ignore. It was then that their work caught the interest of a figure cloaked in authority, a man close to King Louis XIII, an advisor whose name seldom left the lips of commoners but whose influence shaped the fate of nations. This patron did not view the sisters with suspicion but with desire. Their rituals, he believed, could serve the crown itself, ensuring that royal pregnancies were blessed and that heirs to the throne arrived untouched by the failures of nature. He offered them protection, and in return he demanded results. The manor changed under his shadow. What had once been a village refuge became a place where carriages from Paris arrived under cover of night, bearing noble women veiled and trembling. They came not only for safe delivery but for what the sisters called purification. Rituals that promised to cleanse the unborn of weakness, to guard against miscarriage, to secure the favor of heaven. Behind closed doors, however, purification was indistinguishable from torment. The sisters treated noble blood with the same indifference as peasant flesh. Women were bound and cut, their cries muffled by thick cloths so that no sound escaped to the waiting servants outside. Their infants, when born lifeless, were not discarded but preserved in wax, their tiny bodies coated until they shone like grotesque dolls. These were presented to the patron as sacred trophies, proof that failure itself could be made holy. He displayed them in private chambers, arranging them on shelves like relics, convincing himself that he bore witness to mysteries too profound for ordinary eyes. The sisters' methods grew bolder under noble protection. No longer fearful of village suspicion, they refined their instruments and deepened their rituals. They crafted golden masks for some mothers to wear during their final hours, claiming the face must be veiled in purity while the body endured corruption. They bled women in calculated amounts, presenting bowls of blood as offerings for blessings upon royal heirs yet to be conceived. Some infants, born weak but alive, were drowned in warm milk, their last gasps mistaken for blessings whispered into the liquid. These deaths were recorded not as tragedies but as necessary sacrifices, each one tied to the promise that the failures of one womb would strengthen another. The patron, obsessed with securing his power at court, accepted each explanation without question. In his eyes, the sisters were not butchers but visionaries, and their manner became a quiet extension of royal ambition. The psychological toll on Anna and Isolde deepened with every act. They no longer needed to justify their cruelty to themselves. The patron's approval gave them a mirror of legitimacy. They believed that if nobles sought them, then their work was destined, blessed by powers both earthly and divine. Each preserved child became a monument to their purpose, each mother's silence another page in their scripture of pain. They began to speak less of mercy and more of destiny, no longer hiding their hunger behind the language of care. To them, the womb was no longer a place of birth but a field of sacrifice, a battleground where weakness was burned away to reveal strength. They had become both priestesses and scientists of suffering, and under noble protection their doctrine spread into the shadows of courtly life. The village noticed the change but remained silent. More carriages arrived, more mothers vanished, yet no accusation could reach women whose names were now spoken in Parisian salons as trusted advisors. The lantern in the window became less a beacon for villagers and more a signal to distant halls of power, a promise that the sisters were ready to serve those who sought them. Bones continued to pile beneath the floorboards. Wax-coated infants continued to stare with sightless eyes. But above all, hung the illusion of respect. The patron shielded them from scrutiny, and their crimes became untouchable, hidden within the folds of politics and faith. Yet behind every blessing there was a body. Behind every preserved relic a scream. The sisters had bound themselves not only to ritual but to ambition. Their cruelty no longer confined to a village but stretched across the distance to royal courts. The patron believed he had secured power through them, but in truth he had only fed the hunger of minds that could never be satisfied. Their chamber grew darker, their journals thicker, their confidence more unshakable. And still the lantern in the window glowed, its light reaching further into the night, drawing not only the desperate but now the powerful, ensuring that the harvest of innocence would never end. The sisters had long convinced themselves that the womb was not a cradle but a gate, and what passed through it did not belong to the mother or the father but to them. Infants born in their manner were never seen as children. They were harvest, raw material for the rituals that consumed Anna and Isolde. Each birth was followed not by swaddling or lullabies, but by silence and calculation. A cloth soaked in vinegar was pressed to tiny lips to stifle the first cry, so that no sound reached the waiting world. To the mothers, dazed and bound, the absence of a cry was explained as stillbirth, but in the chamber beyond the infants were alive, their breath shallow, their movements small. They were taken not for care but for study, and every life became a test against the limits of endurance. The experiments were carried out with the same patience that marked every act of the sisters' cruelty. Some infants were wrapped tightly in salt-stiffened linen and left in wooden boxes, their skin cracking as moisture was drawn out, their bodies preserved through agony until their tiny lungs failed. Others were placed in basins of warm water, not to be baptized but to test how long their bodies would resist drowning, their limbs flailing weakly before falling still. Anna wrote with fascination about the spasms of the diaphragm, describing them as signs of the soul's struggle to escape. Isolde recorded the times with meticulous care, as though she were counting harvest yields, noting which infants lasted longer, which gave in sooner, as if they were crops of unequal strength. The language of nurture had been replaced entirely with the language of cultivation. In their minds, this was not murder but harvest, the gathering of truths hidden in the fragile bodies of the innocent. Some mothers were left alive long enough to hear their infants' torment. Bound in the upper chamber, too weak to resist, they listened as muffled cries drifted upward from the stone room below. The sisters called this the second labor, a test not of the body but of the soul. Mothers wept until their throats tore, begging to hold their children. But the only response was the steady creak of floorboards as Anna and Isolde passed between rooms carrying bowls of milk or cloths dripping with wine to continue their experiments. The cruelty was not in rage, but in the cold precision of routine, and this made it all the more unbearable. The mother's final hours were spent in despair so profound that death itself became a mercy. The sisters explained away every infant's absence with the same calm they had used to dismiss missing mothers. They told families that some were stillborn, others baptized quickly and buried in consecrated ground before grief could corrupt their memory. Each explanation was wrapped in ritual language so carefully rehearsed that no one dared doubt them. Even noble patrons accepted the deaths as part of divine will, convinced that the sisters' hands had done all they could. Yet behind the closed doors of the chamber, the truth was recorded in journals that grew heavier with each passing season. Those pages described not natural deaths but orchestrated trials. Infants starved deliberately, their cries weakening over days until they became nothing more than whispers. Infants fed bitter herbs to watch how their bodies twisted in pain before life slipped away. To Anna and Isolde, these were not atrocities but data, proof of their belief that pain revealed the hand of God more clearly than comfort ever could. The psychological toll on the sisters was not collapse but transformation. They no longer saw faces when they looked at the children in their arms. They saw only vessels, offerings, and experiments. They spoke to one another not of mothers or sons but of endurance and silence, measuring their success not in lives saved but in screams suppressed. Each infant that died without a sound was praised in their notes as a victory of control, a triumph of discipline over chaos. They convinced themselves that in these moments they glimpsed eternity, that in extinguishing innocence they were purifying the world of weakness. The cruelty became their purpose, and purpose made them strong. Where others would have been shattered by guilt, Anna and Isolde grew steadier, their hands calmer, their eyes colder. The village never saw the tiny graves because there were none. The bodies were disposed of in ways that left no trace. Some were burned in ovens, their ashes mixed with herbs and scattered as powders for supposed blessings. Others were preserved in jars of oil, their forms suspended like grotesque icons, hidden behind shelves of legitimate remedies. The chamber became a museum of silence, each object a reminder that innocence had been harvested not for nurture but for ritual. And yet, above ground, the lantern in the window continued to burn, its light seen as the sign of women devoted to mercy. No villager could have imagined that within those walls mercy had been inverted into its cruelest form, that infants were not cradled but consumed, not blessed but broken. The harvest of innocence was complete, and the sisters had convinced themselves that it was holy. By the time the whispers grew too loud to ignore, the sisters had already woven their influence into places where silence outweighed truth. Too many mothers had vanished. Too many infants had been declared stillborn with no burial scene. And too many servants returning from the manor carried haunted eyes that would not meet the gaze of others. The parish ledger could no longer disguise the gaps in its pages. Rumors crossed from taverns to churches, from villages to noble halls, until even those who wished to look away found their faith in the lantern shaken. The church could not ignore it. A trial was staged, not in the heart of the village but in a larger town nearby, where politics and appearances could shape the outcome more easily than justice ever could. Anna and Isolde entered the court not as trembling accused, but as women wrapped in the guise of devotion. They carried worn books of scripture, their voices calm, their heads bowed, their hands folded as though in prayer. They spoke of mercy and service, reminding all who listened of the countless women they had aided, of the noble families who had entrusted them. They quoted passages that spoke of suffering as divine trial, weaving their doctrine of pain into familiar psalms until cruelty sounded like piety. They even brought forth their journals, but only the pages they wished to show, filled with neat drawings of herbs and notes on the alignment of the stars, leaving hidden the pages thick with blood and torment. The court, already hesitant, saw before them not monsters but healers accused by rumor and jealousy. Their calmness became a shield stronger than any defense, for innocence once performed with conviction can silence even the loudest suspicion. Yet witnesses came, trembling and uncertain, their voices shaking as they described the cries they had heard in the night. The mothers who entered and never returned. Servants spoke of jars filled with preserved infants, of cloth stained with blood far beyond what childbirth could explain. The bishop who had once seen the bones beneath the floorboards was summoned, but he chose his words carefully, describing only his unease, never confessing fully to what he had uncovered. Fear of scandal held his tongue, for to expose the sisters fully would be to expose the church's own failure to protect its flock. His silence weighed heavier than any testimony, for it confirmed what others dared not say aloud. Some truths were too dangerous to speak in public. The nobles arrived as well, cloaked in shadowed loyalty, their presence unspoken but felt in every hesitation of the judges. Too many had sought the sisters' services, too many had secrets bound to their rituals. To condemn Anna and Isolde would be to unravel those alliances, to expose failures in bloodlines and whispered betrayals of faith. And so the court turned its gaze not toward justice, but toward preservation. Questions were softened, accusations redirected, and evidence dismissed as hearsay. When asked why so many women had vanished, the sisters bowed their heads and spoke of convents, of women seeking solitude and grief, of families too ashamed to admit loss. They invoked the names of saints as if cloaking their lies in holiness, and each invocation bent the spine of those who judged them. No mother's body was exhumed, no chamber beneath their manor was searched. The trial became less a pursuit of truth and more a ritual of silence, a performance meant to quell unrest without uncovering what lay beneath. The verdict was never declared as innocence, only as insufficient proof, a phrase that carried the weight of protection. The court closed, the sisters returned home, and the lantern in their window burned as brightly as before. The villagers watching from the shadows understood what had happened. Power had chosen silence over justice, and silence itself had become a sentence, condemning not the guilty but the innocent yet to come. Each scream that would follow, each infant silenced, each mother broken was now sealed beneath the authority of a court that had looked away. The sisters left the trial emboldened. In their eyes, survival was proof of destiny, confirmation that their doctrine was not only true but divinely shielded. They believed they had faced judgment and triumphed, not through lies, but through the strength of their calling. They returned to their manor with calm steps, their journals waiting, their instruments gleaming, their chamber prepared for the next harvest. And as the lantern's light flickered once more in the night sky, It no longer stood as a beacon of hope, but as a symbol of silence, of a world that had chosen to look away while evil carried on, methodical and unbroken, hidden within the calm faces of women who called themselves midwives. When death finally came for Anna and Isolde, it did not arrive in the form of justice. There was no public execution, no punishment to match the weight of their crimes. They slipped quietly into the grave, buried as women of service, their lantern remembered as a symbol of mercy rather than cruelty. The village allowed their memory to fade, eager to believe that silence could erase the horror. But what could not be buried were the objects they left behind. Their journals, their instruments, their preserved relics, all remained hidden in the manor until time unearthed them again. And when they resurfaced more than a century later, they carried with them a shadow that stretched far beyond the village that had once ignored their crimes. The journals appeared first, their leather cracked, their pages stiff with age but still legible. Scholars mistook them for rare medical texts, valuable in their detail, and copies began to circulate among physicians curious about childbirth and pain. At first, the writings were treated with caution, many dismissing them as the ramblings of superstitious midwives. But others saw in them something more, a system, a cold framework for testing the limits of the body, one that echoed the emerging language of science. The doctrine of pain was not accepted openly, yet fragments of it bled into the margins of medical debate. Some argued that suffering should be studied, quantified, and even provoked to reveal truths about endurance. They did not know they were echoing the words of women who addressed torture as discovery. The sisters' cruelty had been disguised so well that even their horrors could pass for knowledge in the hands of those who valued results over compassion. The instruments surfaced next, hidden in crates during renovations of the old manor. Their shapes were strange, their purpose unclear to those who found them. Heated cradles, iron clamps, and womb pumps were examined by doctors who insisted they were prototypes of experimental devices, never suspecting how faithfully they had been used. Some were taken to collections, studied in private academies, or displayed as curiosities of an earlier age. In these sterile rooms, stripped of the screams they had once drawn, the instruments lost their truth. They became artifacts, not confessions, and in that transformation their cruelty was forgotten. Yet the designs lingered, their principles adopted unknowingly into later experiments. In Victorian asylums, women were restrained in similar cradles to control hysteria. In Nazi camps, blood was drained from mothers under the guise of science. Each echo was a reminder that evil, once written and recorded, never truly dies. It changes names, changes hands, but the method remains. The psychological toll of their legacy reached further than the tools themselves. Their shadow fell upon the way society began to view women's bodies, especially in childbirth. Suspicion grew toward midwives whose knowledge had once been trusted but now seemed tainted by whispers of cruelty. Medicine, led by men eager to claim authority, seized the chance to brand women healers as dangerous, superstitious, even murderous. The sisters' story, twisted and half-remembered, was used to strip power from countless innocent midwives who had served faithfully. Their crimes became a weapon against others, shaping laws and customs that placed childbirth in the hands of institutions rather than communities. Thus, their cruelty reached into generations unborn, not only through the echoes of their methods, but through the distrust they had seeded. The journals themselves survived long enough to be locked away in restricted collections. Their language grew darker with each page, and even scholars who sought only history admitted unease as they read. Some noted how the sisters never once spoke of love, only of endurance, sacrifice, and silence. Others pointed to the meticulous timing of screams, the careful notes on despair, and saw in them a foreshadowing of modern cruelty disguised as research. But the journals were never destroyed. They were preserved under the justification of study, and in that decision their voice was allowed to whisper into later centuries. Each generation that opened those pages gave the sisters life again, not as people but as ideas. Ideas that asked whether pain could ever reveal truth. The lantern no longer burns in their manor, but its light has been replaced by another kind of glow. The glow of history's memory, faint but unyielding. The sisters are remembered not by name but by shadow, by the silence they left behind and the cruelty that refused to die with them. Their reign of terror was hushed in their lifetime, but the blood they spilled seeped into the fabric of history, staining medicine, law, and faith alike. They had believed their work was destined, and in a way it was. For even in death, their doctrine of pain lived on, carried not by their hands, but by those who never knew whose words they were repeating. And so their legacy was not a single house with a lantern in the window, but an idea that moved through centuries, hidden, methodical, waiting for the world to look away once more. The manor no longer stands. Time reduced its walls to fragments, its stones scattered into fields where wild grass hides what was once a chamber of screams. Today, a small memorial rests upon the ground where the lantern once glowed, a simple marker placed centuries too late. It carries no names, no list of mothers or infants, no acknowledgement of the suffering that fed its soil. The inscription is plain, speaking only of mercy, as if even now the truth must be softened. Visitors pass by, some pausing in silence, most walking on without knowing that beneath their feet lies a history of ritual deception and cruelty disguised as care. The absence of names is the final echo of the sisters' work. Even in death, the victims remain faceless, erased by the same silence that once shielded their killers. Yet memory does not vanish with walls or names. It lingers in the questions whispered by historians, in the unease of physicians who study old texts, in the distrust that shadows women's bodies in institutions built long after the sisters were gone. Evil, when disguised as mercy, leaves scars that cannot be seen but are felt in the quiet decisions of societies. Laws were shaped in part by their shadow. Midwives stripped of authority. Childbirth surrendered to institutions, women told that their pain was natural, their voices dismissed as weakness. Each change carried the mark of fear, a fear born from the crimes of Anna and Isolde, who proved how easily compassion can be mimicked by cruelty. Their doctrine of pain may have been hidden, but its ghost followed into every room where trust was demanded but never returned. The philosophy they embodied was not only in their journals but in the silence that allowed them to thrive. Neighbors who looked away, bishops who withheld the truth, nobles who protected their own secrets, all became accomplices without lifting a hand. Silence itself became the tool of evil, stronger than any blade or chain, for it turned suspicion into nothing, screams into whispers, and bodies into records marked only as moved away. It is this silence that outlived them, echoing across centuries in every case where cruelty hides beneath the mask of care, waiting for those who benefit to turn their eyes aside. The sisters may have died, but the system that sheltered them never did. To walk the ground where their house once stood is to feel the weight of that silence pressing like earth upon a grave. The wind carries no cries, but imagination fills the air with echoes of muffled infants, of mothers weeping unseen, of prayers twisted into ritual commands. What remains is not just horror, but a question that refuses to fade. How many acts of cruelty even now hide behind faces of innocence? How many lanterns burn in windows across the world, promising safety while concealing suffering within? The story of Anna and Isolde is not distant history, but a reflection of how evil survives. Not in monstrous appearance, but in calm voices, folded hands, and the disguise of mercy. The philosophy of silence is a reminder that evil does not always demand power to endure. It needs only trust and the willingness of others to look away. When care itself becomes the mask, there is no defense, for those who suffer are silenced by the very trust they extend. That is why no names mark the memorial, why the victims are remembered only as numbers, as shadows. To name them would be to admit what was allowed to happen, to break the silence that still binds their memory. And so the stone marker speaks only in generalities, a monument not to the lost, but to the silence that erased them. Evil wears many faces, but the most dangerous is the face of kindness. Anna and Isolde proved that cruelty can thrive not in the shadows, but in the glow of a lantern, offered as hope to those who had none. Their story warns that trust can be weaponized, that innocence can be harvested, and that silence will always be the accomplice that makes evil eternal. As the narration closes, the memorial fades into the image of an empty window, its lantern forever extinguished, and the question remains hanging in the quiet. What do you think? Could this happen again? Hidden where mercy is promised, and would we recognize it? Or would silence protect it once more?